There were strangers living in my dead mother's house. I had driven over on a Tuesday to check on the place, the way I did every week, and the locks were different. The curtains were ones I did not own. And when I knocked, a man I had never seen opened my mother's front door as though it were his. He was perhaps 35, comfortable, unbothered. "Can I help you?" I said. "This is my mother's house. She passed away last year. I own it. Who are you?" He did not even blink. He said, "We rent here. We have a lease. You cannot just show up and harass us. We have rights." He held up a piece of paper, a lease, with a signature on it that was meant to be my mother's. I asked to see it. He let me because he was certain. That was his mistake, because I read the date at the top of that lease, and the date was in March. My mother died the previous October. I handed it back to him, and I kept my voice very calm. I said, "I will be back, and when I am, I will not be alone." My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher, widow. My mother was named Ruth. She died last October at 89 in the small house on Linden Street where she had lived for 50 years and where I grew up. When she passed, I could not bring myself to sell it. Not yet. The house was full of her china still in the cabinet, her reading chair by the window with the dent still in the cushion, the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where she had measured me and my brother every birthday until we were grown. So I kept it. I paid the taxes. I kept the utilities on, in my name, so the pipes would not freeze and the house would not feel abandoned. And every single week, I drove the 20 minutes to Linden Street, let myself in, opened the windows, watered my mother's ferns, and sat for a little while in her reading chair. It was not a sad ritual. It was how I was saying goodbye slowly, which is the only way I know how to say goodbye to anyone. I tell you all of this so you understand what it meant to drive up on a Tuesday in spring and find the locks changed. For a moment, I thought I had the wrong house. Then I saw my mother's address on the mailbox and curtains in the window that were not hers, and I understood that someone had broken into my mother's home and was living in it. The man who opened the door called it renting. He showed me a lease with my mother's forged signature on it, and he told me I had no right to be there, that he had tenants' rights, and that if I came back and bothered him, he would call the police on me. Think about that for a moment. He threatened to call the police on me for knocking on the door of my own mother's house. I drove home. I did not cry, though I wanted to. I have learned that the time for feeling comes later, and that the time right after a shock is for thinking. So I thought. And here's what I already knew, sitting in my car outside my own mother's stolen house. I knew the lease was a forgery because it was dated in March, and my mother had been dead since October. A dead woman cannot sign a lease. That single fact, that one date, turned their whole story to paper. I knew I had the deed to the house, in my name, filed properly after my mother's estate was settled. I knew I had the utility bills, in my name, going back to October, proving I had kept and maintained the house continuously, that it was never abandoned, that no one had any business inside it. I knew I had something else too, though I did not yet know how much it would matter. I keep records. I had a small notebook in which I wrote the date of every weekly visit to my mother's house, because that is simply the kind of woman I am. I had written, in my own hand, every Tuesday for months. Visited Mom's house, watered ferns, all well. The last entry, the Tuesday before, said the house was empty and locked and fine. These people had broken in sometime in the last 7 days, and I could prove it. But I also knew one more thing, and this is the thing that makes these stories so infuriating, the thing you may already know if this has happened to someone you love. I knew that when I called the police, there was a very good chance they would tell me there was nothing they could do, that it was a civil matter, that I would have to take it to court, slowly, for months, while strangers lived in my mother's house and slept in my mother's rooms. I was right. That is exactly what the first officer told me. But I did not accept it. Because being told nothing can be done is not the same as nothing being able to be done. It usually just means you have not yet found the right person, with the right document, standing in the right place. So, I called Patricia. If you have ever been told that something unbearable was simply the way it is, and refused to believe it, stay with me. Because the date on that lease was the loose thread, and Patricia knew exactly how to pull it. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every day. The first police officer came out to Linden Street and told me what I had feared. He stood on the sidewalk, polite and sorry and useless, and he said, "Mrs. Brooks, I understand you are upset, but they are showing a lease. Once someone is living in a property and claiming tenancy, we cannot just remove them. It becomes a civil matter. You would need to go through the courts. An eviction." I said, "Officer, that lease is dated in March. My mother died in October. She could not have signed it. It is a forgery." He said, "That may be true, ma'am, but I cannot determine that here on the sidewalk. A judge would have to. I am sorry." And he left. I want to be fair to that officer. He was not lying, and he was not lazy. He was telling me how the system usually works, and how the people inside my mother's house were counting on it working. That is the entire scheme. You produce a piece of paper, you say the magic word tenant, and you turn a break-in into a civil dispute that takes months, during which you live for free in someone else's home. The man in my mother's house, whose name I would later learn was Dustin Pryor, had done this before. Patricia found that out. He had a pattern. He looked for houses that were owned but empty. Recently inherited houses especially. Houses where the owner had died and the family was grieving and slow. He would break in, change the locks, produce a forged lease, and dare the rightful owner to spend a year and a fortune in court getting him out. Most people gave up, or paid him to leave. Cash for keys, they call it. He had turned other people's grief into a business. He had picked my mother's house because he thought a grieving daughter would be an easy, slow, frightened mark. He had not checked who the grieving daughter was. I called Patricia that same afternoon, and I laid it all out. The strangers, the forged lease, the date, the officer, the civil matter. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing that changed everything. She said, "Eleanor, listen to me carefully. They have made a mistake, and they do not know it yet. A squatter standoff is a civil matter, and the police are right to be cautious about that, because they cannot referee competing claims on a sidewalk. But that is not what you have. You do not have a competing claim. You have a forged legal document." She said, "The moment they presented a lease with your dead mother's signature, dated 5 months after her death, they stopped being a civil tenancy dispute and became forgery and attempted fraud. Those are crimes, and crimes are not a civil matter. Crimes are exactly what the police can act on." I said, "So how do we prove it to them?" She said, "We do not argue. We document. We are going to build a package so complete that the police cannot look away from it, and we are going to hand it to a detective, not a patrol officer, because a patrol officer manages a sidewalk, and a detective builds a case." So we built it. It took 2 days. The first document was my mother's death certificate. October. Plain and absolute. The simplest proof in the world that a lease she supposedly signed in March was a lie. The second was the deed to the house, in my name, properly recorded. The third was the stack of utility bills in my name, unbroken from October to the present, proving continuous ownership and maintenance, proving the house was never abandoned and never available to rent. The fourth was my little notebook. Every Tuesday, in my own handwriting. Visited Mom's house. All well. House empty and locked. The last entry, 7 days before the break-in, in ink, dated, ordinary, and devastating to their story. And the fifth, the one Patricia said would matter most, was a copy of Dustin Pryor's pattern. Patricia made some calls. It turned out 2 other families in 2 other towns had quietly dealt with a man matching his description and method in the past 3 years. He was not a tenant who had been wronged. He was a man who hunted dead women's houses. Patricia put all 5 things into a folder. Then she made one phone call to a detective she knew in the county fraud unit, a woman named Detective Alvarez, and she said, I have a clean, documented case of lease forgery and fraud against a recidivist, and the victim is a 63-year-old widow whose mother's home was stolen while she grieved. Would you like to take a look? Detective Alvarez would very much like to take a look. 2 days after a patrol officer told me on a sidewalk that there was nothing he could do, I sat across a desk from a detective who looked at 5 documents in a folder, tapped the death certificate with one finger, and said the most satisfying sentence I had heard in weeks. She said, "A dead woman did not sign a lease in March. This is not a tenant. This is forgery. We can work with this." If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever been told nothing could be done and refused to accept it, leave me a comment. Tell me about the time you did not give up. I read every single one. I told Dustin Pryor I would be back and that I would not be alone. I kept that promise. I came back to Linden Street 4 days later, and this time there was a detective beside me and 2 uniformed officers behind her, and a folder in her hand that contained the end of his scheme. He opened my mother's door with the same comfortable, unbothered face. It did not last. Detective Alvarez did the talking. I want to be honest that I had wanted to do the talking, had rehearsed it in the car, but she advised me gently to let her handle it, and she was right, because there is a particular weight to a thing being said by a person with a badge and a case file. She said, "Mr. Pryor, you provided this woman with a residential lease bearing the signature of Ruth Brooks, dated in March of this year. Ruth Brooks died in October of last year. We have her death certificate. A lease signed by a deceased person 5 months after her death is a forged instrument. That is a felony. We also have documentation of a similar pattern in 2 other jurisdictions." The comfortable face was gone now. Underneath it was the face of a man rapidly recalculating. He said, "I rented this in good faith. I have a lease. If the lease is fake, then I'm a victim too. I did not know." Detective Alvarez said, "Then you will have no trouble giving us the name and contact information of the person who rented it to you, and the record of every payment you made to them, right now, on paper." He did not have a name. He did not have payment records, because there was no landlord. There was only him, and a forged signature, and a scheme that had just collided with a woman who writes down the date every time she waters her dead mother's ferns. It did not happen in a single dramatic instant, the way it would in a film. These things move at the speed of paperwork, but it moved. Faced with a fraud charge instead of a civil eviction, faced with a documented pattern, faced with a detective rather than a frightened daughter, Dustin Pryor and the woman with him were out of my mother's house within 72 hours, under the supervision of the court, and Pryor was facing charges that had his full attention. The forged lease he had waved in my face on the doorstep, the document he was so certain would protect him, was the single piece of paper that ended him. He had signed a dead woman's name to it. He had dated it. He had handed it to me to read. He had built the weapon that was used against him, and then he had handed it to me because he was so sure that I was too old and too grieved and too slow to know what to do with it. When it was over, I went into my mother's house. The strangers had left it a mess, but it was still hers underneath. The china in the cabinet, the dent in the reading chair, the pencil marks on the doorframe. I opened the windows. I watered the ferns, which had survived, the way my mother's things tended to survive. And then I sat in her reading chair for a long time, longer than usual, and I let the feeling come, now that the thinking was done. I called Patricia from that chair. I said, "They are gone. The house is mine again." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Your mother would have liked how you handled that. Calm, documented, relentless." I said, "My mother taught me to keep records. She used to say that a tidy paper trail is a woman's best friend. I used to think it was just something she said." Patricia said, "It turns out it was a will, and a deed, and a death certificate, and a notebook." I said, "And a friend who knew which detective to call." She said, "That too." It is 2 months later. The house on Linden Street is quiet and clean and mine. I have decided finally what to do with it. I am going to sell it when I am ready, and a young family is going to grow up making their own pencil marks on that kitchen door frame. My mother would have liked that better than an empty shrine. I think I am almost ready. Dustin Pryor is working his way through the court system now, on the other side of the table for once, learning that the houses of the dead are not as unguarded as he believed. Detective Alvarez sent me a note. She said my folder was the most organized case file she had received all year, and that if I ever wanted a second career, the fraud unit could use me. I told her I had already had 2 careers, and that I intended to spend the third one watering ferns. I think about that man on the doorstep. How certain he was. How comfortable. How sure that a grieving woman my age would be slow and frightened and easy. He was counting on my grief to make me weak. He did not understand that grief, in a certain kind of woman, does not make her weak. It makes her careful. It makes her write down the date she waters the ferns. It makes her keep the death certificate in a folder, and the deed beside it, and the phone number of a friend who knows what to do. They always think the paperwork is the boring part. The paperwork is the part that wins. Keep your records, keep your deeds and your dates and your proof. Not because you are suspicious, because someday someone may decide that your grief has made you an easy mark, and on that day, a tidy paper trail really will be your best friend. My mother told me that. She was right. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has anyone ever tried to take something that was yours and assumed you would be too tired to fight? Tell me what happened. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe, because tomorrow's story will stay with you too.